Yes, this is Fernando Trevino, the Executive Director for the East Chicago Waterway Management District. The district is a non-federal partner on the Grand Cale River West project, along with Atlantic Richfield and BP. Also present is Mr. John Feckety, which is our board president for the district. Natalie Mills and Ben O'Neill will be presenting a summary of the Grand Cale River West project. And I'll let Natalie or Ben introduce any other representatives from the Corps. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you, Fernando. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to brief on our project. As Fernando indicated, my name is Natalie Mills. I am a project manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. As indicated by Fernando, present, we have Ben O'Neill, who's our technical lead on the project, as well as Sam Belchick, who is one of our biologists who helped in the design of the project. So the Lake George Canal Restoration Project, it's a multi-phase project in support of USCPA's restoration efforts at the Grand Cale River area of concern. The purpose for Lake George Middle and East is to remove or contain contaminated sediments in the Lake George Canal to improve sediment quality, water quality, and habitat in an effort to delist the Grand Calumet River area concern. So there are a couple features of the project, including the phase 1 dredging. There's phase 2 dredging, which will be forthcoming, and then there's the middle section restoration project, which we are going to, which is currently under construction, which we're going to provide an update on right now. Ben, do you want to start sharing your screen? Ben, are you there?
Yeah, sure, Natalie. Yep. Should be popping up right now.
Yes, come in. Yep, I see it.
Sorry, give me just a moment. There we go.
All right, there you go.
Should I go ahead and get started?
Yeah,
now?
can you go ahead and start with the technical presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Ben O'Neill. I'm an environmental engineer here with the Army Corps of Engineers. So a few slides to show you on the Lake George Canal middle section restoration, and then we'll just kind of talk about Lake George Canal east section remediation. So let's go ahead and get started. This first slide, I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here and on the care committee. You guys are all very familiar with the Grand Calumet area concern. In fact, we just talked about the junction reaches here and the East Branch Phase 2 here. Orphan areas are up here. So we're going to talk about Lake George Canal, which is this section right here, right? So the IDEM, EPA, and stakeholders, and a lot of people on this call have made a lot of progress on the Grand Calumet area of concern. Just a few straggling projects here. Arguably, maybe some of the more complicated projects, and so the middle I would certainly characterize as that, and we'll get into that a little bit more here. I'm going to zoom in. I know you guys are familiar with the area, but we're zooming in on the Indiana Harbor Canal waterway here. And this map is just to show sort of the industrialized nature of the area we're working with. That's something you guys are all very familiar with. But to this area, this region is a huge economic driver, not only for the region, but the nation. A lot of raw materials being produced here, petroleum compound, or I'm sorry, petroleum, oil and gas, as well as steel manufacturing. That's largely due to the Indiana Harbor Ship Canal right here. No surprise, waterborne commerce is transporting a lot of that material. The Lake George Canal is a branch of the Indiana Harbor Ship Canal. It was dug out was man-made in the early 1900s to connect to the ship canal, right? To bring some more waterborne commerce opportunity to the region and create a new leg where industries could participate in that. It's called Lake George Canal because it's hydraulically connected to Lake George up here. Depending on hydrologic conditions, what's going on in Lake Michigan, as well as precipitation and hydrology in the region, Lake George Canal will empty through through Calumet Avenue Ditch, down to Lake George here, and then all the way to the west, we have Lake George West. It'll flow through this land bridge here. There's some culverts out middle, east, and generally it flows out to the canal. You talk about it flowing somewhat loosely. It's a very quiescent canal. You could almost consider it a lake. There's not a lot of flow through here. It's primarily a dead end. There's a lot of control structures, say at Lake George and then at the land bridge here. And so most of the flow is going to occur through this Indiana Harbor leg. The Grand Calumet leg of the Indiana Harbor, which goes out to the canal. So very, hydraulically complicated, but relatively passive canal. Zoom in a little bit more. And so now we're focusing on Lake George, and this slide is just to sort of communicate the history of what's happened around Lake George. So most of you, or some of you, may be familiar with the former ECI parcels. ECI is Energy Cooperative Inc. It was the last holder of these parcels of land as an industrial parcel of land. It was a petroleum refinery, manufacturing facility that operated for many years and then closed, I believe, sometime in the 80s when bankrupt. And so a lot of the subgrade components, the pipes and storage tanks were left behind. Some of the above grade features, the manufacturing facilities were raised. You can see a couple of holes in the ground right here, right, where some of the a couple of tanks used to be. But, generally speaking, this was a fairly contaminated parcel of land for a long time. Was bankrupt. After it went bankrupt, it went unused for a long time. And not surprisingly, a lot of the contaminants leaked into the canal. And it's a very quiescent canal, so they weren't really leaving the canal. So that's become a bit of an issue. So we have these former ECI parcels. I won't be talking about those too much, but I'll just mention that BP and the stakeholders have been working on some remedy for these parcels, the South Tank Farm, upland areas of the West Tank Farm, and et cetera. And a lot of those efforts are ongoing right now. There's been a fair amount of pipeline removal, but there's still some work being done. Of course, this large parcel of land to the east here, this is the Indiana Harbor Canal Confined Disposal Facility, operated by the Corps of Engineers. This is where we discharge dredged sediment dredged from the federal navigation channel of the Indiana Harbor. The Lake Mary restoration, I just want to point out that we're neighbors to the Lake Mary restoration project. That was a fairly significant effort by DNR and IDEM to restore this area, restore those wetlands, and restore native habitat. And so we wanted to be, when we were coming up with this project, we wanted to be very sensitive to that. It looks great down there these days. It's a long way from where it was a decade ago. Just west of the project we're talking about now, Lake George Middle, is the land bridge. We call it the land bridge. This was let's say a pile of dirt that was added to the canal shortly after it was built, and it was added to provide access by J&L to some disposal pits so they could easily cross the canal here. Recently, BP has done some restoration here, enhanced some of the culverts through there. So there were some recent actions that were taking place there as well. Here's an overhead view. This is right around the time we started construction, I believe early this spring. So we're at the railroad bridge, which I think I forgot to point out just a moment ago. The railroad bridge runs, you can see my screen, it runs at the interface between middle and east. So we're in a drone right now. We're flying above the railroad bridge and we're looking west. This was shortly after one of our contractors did some Phragmites removal. So this area along the north bank is all mowed. You can see the Lake Mary area over here on the left-hand side of the screen, and then the former ECI parcel. This is the pollution control area, and the Hammond Tank Farm over here on the east side of the screen. And then just a quick shot of just a little, here's the railroad bridge again. Now we're flying just a little bit east of the railroad bridge, and we're looking over the confined disposal facility. This is a nice view of all the development in the area. Kind of highlights all the industrial activity that takes place here. Got some dredge barges right next to our CDF unloading some material. And you can also see in this photo kind of a constant presence in Lake George Canal. There's some sheen here, and you will find the sheen more or less throughout the canal at all times, an oil sheen. And it's coming from different locations, but principally we think it's coming from the sediment below. Moving back over to Lake George Middle. This slide is just to highlight how isolated the canal is here. So, as we just talked about, we have these former ECI sites sort of surrounding the site. To access Lake George Canal Middle, you have to enter through BP's Whiting Refinery, either through the north or, they have an access gate to the south. It's not accessible to the public, very isolated here. Of course, it's not well accessible by marine access either. The railroad bridge is a low-hanging bridge. Boats generally can't make it under that bridge. And of course, they're not going to make it past the land bridge. If you were to make it out here and grab some sediments, this is what it would look like. So this photo here on the right is a bit of sediment from the canal. It smells like what it looks like, which is a very organic, rich, weak, oil-rich sediment. You can tell by looking at it, it's very weak in strength. It's basically like a pudding. Very high water saturation, very weak.
Fine, and back to
The photo next. The photo right next to that is a photo looking over the side of the barge when we were collecting these sediment samples. So, we collect them by a drill rig. The drill rig drops in, and as soon as it drops in, these oil sheens just rise to the surface. Once disturbed, the oil kind of releases and releases the sheen. So this is basically a photo of the surface of the lake while collecting the sample. Here's a cross-section of, that sediment investigation, a cross-section along the northern part of the canal. This figure in the lower left here is the stratigraphy, the different layers of sediment that are within the canal. So at the top is the water, and then down here is the sediment surface. This pink section is this really weak, soft, contaminated material. So in this slide, I'm just pointing out that there's quite a bit of it. There's, areas where we have maybe 10 feet of this really weak sediment. And then below that, you start to get into the more natural canal bottom, the original, you might say, bottom of the canal. Gets more sandy, a little more silty, and then clayey as you go down. This is contaminated, right? When we talk about Grand Calumet, where we're often looking at the total PAHs, those tend to be drivers of toxicity for the canal. So total PAHs, of course, is total petroleum aromatic hydrocarbons. generally, byproducts from petroleum combustion or petroleum production, start to get concerned when they're above 27 parts per million. In Lake George Middle here, our maximum was well over an order of magnitude above that, above 700. So it was fairly high in terms of PAHs. High enough that it's a concern for aquatic organisms, for water quality. That's getting back to our BUIs that we're trying to address, right? That's a problem. The contaminated sediment itself is a problem. And then also this oil sheen is a problem, right? You might consider that an aesthetic issue. So both of those are things that this project seeks to tackle, is addressing the contaminated sediment and then doing something about the oil sheens as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Again, just to point out that BP has done a fair amount of work. They've done a series of studies, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, to look at contamination in the Hammond Tank Farm pollution control area and West Tank Farm, to come up with some remedies, some paths forward for how to address it. One of the things that was recommended was related to something going on in the West Tank Farm, and that is groundwater interacts with the oil that's present in the soil, and it flows through the banks here and out into the canal. So, getting back to that oil sheen, something we want to address. We did incorporate bank controls of the West Tank Farm into our contract, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in just a moment. So okay, we need to address the contaminated sediment. We need to address the oil coming through the banks at the West Tank Farm. Here's a cartoon illustrating how this design looks. It's not a very visually appealing cartoon, but I think it's easier to look at than engineering drawing, so I include it here. Basically, what you're looking at here is we're placing a sediment or a sand cap over top of most of the sediment in the canal. And I'll talk in more detail about what that sand cap looks like, but that's the principal remedy here for the contaminated sediment. There'll be an amended cap to sequester and contain those contaminants. On the western side of the canal, we have some armoring. There's, as I mentioned, there's those culverts through the land bridge. There's some high flows there that could be erosive, and so we needed to armor some sections over there. Install a sheet pile wall at the eastern end of the canal. The reason for that is, well, the typical analogy that you'll often hear is it's like a tube of toothpaste when you place a sediment cap over top of it, where we don't want that really weak contaminated sediment to just squeeze out and move downstream into other areas of the canal. So install a sheet pile wall to keep it in place. There's the bank controls here at the West Tank Farm. And, there's this is what we call the wetland shelf. It's still part of the sediment cap, but we do some more intensive planting of emergent and submergent plants, which we'll talk about in just a moment, to better tie in with this Lake Mary project. And then creating a buffer of native species sort of around the canal, getting rid of a lot of that Phragmites that was there and restoring some of the natural features around it as well to the north. A couple cartoons showing what the sediment cap looks like. So most of the sediment cap is this salmon tan color here. This is what we call the sandy cap, cap A. Here's a cross section. At the very bottom of the cross section is the contaminated sediment. and then we'll start building the cap in layers going up. Excuse me. First layer we'll place is a stabilization layer at 6 inches of sand. That'll help provide some strength to that weak sediment. We'll place the sand and allow it to consolidate for 90 days, give it some time to grow strength. Provides a bedding layer for the next couple layers. This next layer is 6 inches mixed with organophilic clay. It's really the workhorse of the cap. The organophilic clay is, as it sounds, it's a clay mineral that's been modified to absorb organic materials like the things we're concerned about in the canal, oil and PAHs. So it's that material will very strongly bind to the contaminants and prevent dissolved contaminants from getting into the water column, and prevent oil releases from releasing through the amended layer there. Above that is what you might call the habitat layer. Provides some armoring, some stability for the organoclay layer, but it also provides a layer for benthic organisms and other critters to build into and create some habitat. The area to the west, the armor area, is almost exactly the same. It's just the flows are a little bit higher. So instead of the habitat layer, we have to install some riprap so it doesn't erode the organoclay. And then the west tank farm area is very similar to the other areas. It's just instead of this organoclay mixed with sand layer, it's a geotextile mixed with organoclay, or geotextile impregnated with organoclay. So you can consider it a blanket, maybe like a fabric type-ish blanket that you just drape over the banks, and so that's what's going to absorb that oil sheen. And this slide, I just want to mention, that the cap was designed to provide 100-year lifetime of ensuring that we don't exceed that 27 parts per million total pH goal, as well as sizing for the amount of oil release we expect. It isn't a new or novel approach to sediment capping. That's fairly common. Most of the people on this call have probably seen or heard about it on Grand Cal River. In fact, there's some reaches that use almost or very similar capping techniques here. Just a quick slide showing the cross section of what the cap, looks like. Just sort of visualize what it looks like when it's placed. Basically, just draped over the existing sediment, and then extends up the bank here. There is an existing wall. We call it the Wakefield Wall. It was installed when the canal was first built to help with the excavation. And so on the northern side, the cap is installed all the way to the top of the wall. And then above that is the ecosystem restoration component. Here's the wetland shelf. This slide is showing sort of the transition of going from the upland area of the Lake Mary area restoration, and then down into the submergent aquatic vegetation. And Sam Belchuk, I know I'm putting you on the spot with the slide, but was there anything you wanted to mention in terms of the aquatic features, the aquatic habitat, and the wetland shelf and other projects? Sorry, Sam, you might be on mute if you're trying to talk. That's okay, we'll circle back there. I know principally, the submerged aquatic vegetation, which is this area here, is primarily eelgrass. This was something we worked in coordination with Fish and Wildlife Service. We're really interested in creating some food sources for diving ducks. Diving ducks like this area, and now that we're cleaning up the oil sheen and fixing up the sediment, we wanted to provide some habitat for them. There'll be some woody debris. So, any of the areas we clear, we'll save some of the woody debris and plant it or place it along the wetland shelf to provide some more habitat. And then a thin layer of cobble for some other, aquatic species there too. As you get upland, you get into more of the emergent wetland vegetation and then into more traditional upland vegetation the farther up the banks you get. Here's the West Tank Farm, bank controls. I just want to mention too that this, this remedy was largely done by BP and their consultants. We incorporated into the use-based contract just because it made a lot of sense for a source control standpoint to get this in place before we did the sediment capping. So this work is largely a collaboration between BP, their engineers, as well as the East Chicago Waterway Management District, and getting this contract in and or getting this feature and incorporating into the contract. I already talked about what the cross sections look like, right? There's sand and there's some matting and there's some stone on top of that. Here's some actual photos from the installation. Here's the crew installing the reactive core mat up the bank. So this is what's going to drive over the sand and prevent those contaminants from coming out. Then the armor riprap was actually installed as a marine mattress, just a bag of rocks essentially. So this is easy to install and remove if we need to, but it's just installed by crane, as you see here, and sort of draped over the geotextile to provide some armoring along the banks there. And then last slide on Lake George Middle. Here's a photo on the right here is the sheet pile wall. This is them sort of mid-installation. This actually gets installed much lower than what you see below the water level. They're just sort of initially setting up their alignment here. That was completed. So of course, mobilization, site prep, sheet pile wall were all completed. West Tank Farm Banks is mostly complete. We're just waiting on, we were waiting on some funding to do some additional excavation along the banks. We expect that to finish up here in the next, I don't know, hopefully month, couple weeks, depending on when all the paperwork gets signed for the funding. Sediment stabilization capping layer was largely just placed, just finished up. There were a couple areas of the canal that we think were more weak than we were originally anticipating. So we're going to go back and do some more stabilization. They could install some geogrids just to make sure that, we have a competent bedding layer for the next phase of the actual sediment capping. I don't remember if I mentioned this, but the sediment stabilization layer needs to rest for 90 days to build up that strength. So once we have that, 90 days worth of strength built up, our contractor is going to go out and finish up the rest of the capping. It'll take a few months to cap the rest of the canal. And then the original schedule anticipates that'll be done this year. The following year, we'll come back and do some of the habitat restoration activities. And then we expect construction complete later next year. Contractor will likely continue going out there and making sure those habitat features are established and the cap is staying in place. And so they'll maintain a presence out there for the next few years, but construction will be complete in 2023. So that's really the presentation on Lake George Middle there. I guess I wanted to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or comments from the group.
Hey, Ben, before we take the questions, I think Sam was able to dial in. Sam, are you able to, in case you wanted to? Okay, great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, Ben, you did a real great overview real fast of the wetland shelf and all the ecology, but just want to continue saying that we really wanted to tie in a lot of that, the Lake Mary restoration, and then just continue to expand on habitat for fishes and birds, and we specifically, as Ben mentioned, we had specifically chosen some of the submerged aquatic vegetation for those diving ducks that we already know are out there. But yeah, we just really wanted to expand on that, and that's why we wanted to have as much habitat variability and heterogeneity as possible in this transition zone between the upland restoration and the wetland shelf with cobble and woody debris. So that was pretty much it. Just as much habitat as we can have, the better, in my opinion. So.
Definitely. Thanks, Sam.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to just talk about proximity, just so you guys know. We talked about a lot of mention about BP property. So the contractor does access this site through BP's Whiting Refinery. So that is the location, and that is how all of us have to gain access, is through BP's Whiting Refinery. So it's not accessible to the public.
John, this is Kay. May I ask a question or bring a point forward?
Sure.
Okay, didn't know if I'm not doing well with my technology today. Good morning to the core team. My name is Kay Nelson. I'm with the Northwest Indiana Forum and original member of the CARE Committee. I just wanted to bring to your attention, because I know you won't have an answer for this, that I was in Milwaukee yesterday at the Great Lakes Port Association annual meeting, where a panel presentation entitled "Ports Are About to Get Shallower" was populated by representatives of both the Detroit and Chicago districts with regards to the binational effort to update Great Lakes water datum, and how will that impact dredging and disposal capacity at ports. And if the core team that's on this call is not familiar with that initiative, you may want to quickly visit your compadres. The Chicago district person was Paul Mazzino, Chief of Operations Division. He sent a alternate to speak on his behalf, but not being a mariner at that level of size boat anyhow, but having hung around this project since it began, before it began, the low water datum change may be an impact on some of your design work. So, and with that, I have to jump to another call. So I don't expect an answer, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to bring that into the dialogue for an answer at a future time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kay. And I'll just mention quickly, because I think I forgot to mention it in the presentation earlier. For this particular area of Indiana Harbor Canal, Lake George Middle in particular, this section isn't used for very much. It hasn't been dredged in 50 or 60 years, in part because of this railroad bridge extends here, but also because the federal channel, the channel that the Corps maintains, really ends at roughly midway towards the CDF here. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right here, if you look at the center dike in the CDF and extend it downward, yes, it's roughly where the federal channel is. So so there's no dredging that occurs here. This is actually a much shallower section than what you would see out here in the east. So it's certainly possible that revised sediment depths, depending on how much they're going to change, are going to change some of the hydraulics here. But in terms of the hydraulic design of the cap, it was designed very conservatively. So at least for the Lake George Middle section, I wouldn't expect any impacts. Of course, when we talk about the rest of the Indiana Harbor Canal project that the Corps works on, changing the sediment depths would, change things a bit. But at least for Lake George Middle, hopefully will be minimal, if any, type of effect on this project.
Okay, well, I appreciate that response, Ben, and do understand the nuances of the Lake George branch compared to the FedNav branch, but I don't understand hydrology as well as you all do as to what the impact of a foot difference in the low water datum would, would come up to. So I just would hate like heck to see that interfere with a project, with the progress everyone's making on these things. So thank you, and hate to run, but thanks. Your presentation was very interesting.
Thank you, Kay. Are there any other questions or comments?
I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, but I do have a question.
Yes.
I noticed this project, it looks like it's all being done in the city of Hammond, and I wanted to know if there was any involvement with anyone from the city of Hammond or any public member from the city of Hammond. It seems like there's a lot of construction, a lot of activity, but very little in the way of local participation or information.
So yeah, our coordination was primarily with ARBP and ECWMD, no members of the community.
I'm sorry, East Chicago Waterway Management District?
Correct. Yeah, they're one of the project partners.
I would point out that by Indiana state statute, they don't represent anyone outside of the city of East Chicago. So they couldn't actually represent anyone from Hammond with regard to this project by law.
So they own the property at the West Tank Farm. So they were involved in that portion.
But they would also have authority over Hammond property. I'm a little confused.
No, they do not have authority, but the properties that we worked on that were in Hammond is owned by ARBP, and we worked with them.
I would just suggest that you get more public participation from people who actually live in the community and who, it's a different city.
Sure.
And it seems to me that you've done all this work without informing the people who should be informed. I noticed even the care committee doesn't have anyone from the city of Hammond, one of the largest cities of the area of concern. There's nothing. So as I would suggest that you look into that. I know you're far along with this and probably won't change anything, but I think it is lacking public participation and public input.
I did reach out to Dean Button from Hammond. Sent him. We had a flyer that we put together. So I did to Dean to try to kind of help disseminate to the city of Hammond. Are you familiar? Do you know Dean Button?
He's the city engineer, but he's an employee of the city of Hammond. Hammond has an entire environmental department. And again, nothing from the public here, not one resident. I'm looking for this list here, and there's lots of you there, but I wonder if anybody in this meeting actually lives or works in Hammond. I mean, it's a great project, but the public had no input.
Mr. Morrisroe, perhaps Mr. Trevino can discuss this in more detail, but there was a considerable public outreach that was done as the feasibility study for this project was being done. And Fernando, I don't know if you can discuss that a little bit more, and that might go to some of Mr. Morrisroe's concerns.
Yeah, so when we went through the remedial investigation, feasibility study, and remedial design, there was a couple outreach exercises to the community for input in the feasibility study and in the remedial design, and that public input request was not wasn't particular to East Chicago. It was it went through to Northwest Indiana. So there was an outreach exercise for the remedial design. And as Natalie mentioned earlier, there was also a fact sheet that was put together that summarized the project and some of the details, and that was sent out to stakeholders. And I believe it included the city of Hammond, didn't it, Natalie?
Yes.
Definitely a good comment. I think the public participation is very important. I just wanted to mention real quick, just for reference, this section of the canal is in both East Chicago and Hammond. The dividing line is roughly along former White Oak Avenue, I believe it is. It's not actually a road, but if you were to connect the two dots, this east side is East Chicago and the west side is Hammond. I just wanted to mention that for reference.
Can I make a comment, please?
Absolutely. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, to follow up the gentleman that raised the concern, I happen to be a citizen of Hammond, and I think I saw those requests for public input in the newspaper, but I didn't participate because my recollection is it was geared towards East Chicago, that it was the East Chicago Sanitary District or the East Chicago Canal, and they were looking for input from citizens in East Chicago. And I thought, well, I live in Hammond. If I go to that meeting, I'll be out of place. That was my recollection. I didn't see it being an open call, and it looks like more than 75% of this project is in Hammond. That's just my perspective as, I'll quote, an average citizen. So when I saw that in the Times years ago, I thought that doesn't concern me because I don't live in East Chicago and they'll probably tell me you don't belong here. So had I known it was going to be in Hammond, had I known the scope of this, I would have participated, no question about it. And I see that the project is so far along, I can't envision anybody taking any public comment now. And shame on the city of Hammond for not invoking the citizenship to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you both for the comment. Certainly something to consider with like outreach and how we can better improve. Thought that that article was, open, and maybe it wasn't clear that it was open to everyone's feedback. So certainly something for us to consider as we continue to move and work in the future. Thank you.
If can I say some more, please?
Absolutely.
And so it would be interesting to know if any public citizens from East Chicago participated. And the fact that the disposal facility is within a stone's reach, that no one said, hey, why can't we vacuum or dredge this material out and put it in the facility? I couldn't think of it being any closer. And that would have been my major comment, is why would you cap something when you have a disposal facility nearby? You don't even have to truck it.
I would echo that concern. I don't think this is a very good project. I think this says that this community in Hammond doesn't deserve to have their community cleaned up, and you're essentially making a hazardous waste disposal facility under the water. So it's nice, and I'd like to see the interest in the area, but I can assure you that had the public had more input in this on the Hammond side, I don't think we would have accepted that an underwater disposal facility is what we're entitled to. I mean, you have one of the wealthiest corporations in the world involved. They have ample funds to do this right. So it's nice, but it's really not what we deserve.
Yeah, good comments. I do want to mention, Michael brought up the feasibility study that was developed by Tetra Tech on behalf of ECWMD and EPA, I believe, several years ago, 2015. They looked at a variety of options for different remedies for this area, dredging and disposal being one of them. There were extensive, public outreach at that time. It was several years ago, so I wasn't involved and don't know all the details, but I will mention, a couple of things there. One is this cap is a fairly common practice, and I wouldn't call it, creating a landfill. The organoclay binds to contaminants and essentially makes them, for lack of a better word, inert, right? It makes them less bioavailable. It captures the oil. So really what we're doing there is organoclay is used, for example, in treatment plants. So it's sort of a combination of treatment and sequestration, right? We're immobilizing the contaminant. In terms of disposal in the CDF, although it is right there and it was discussed at length, it's not an economical viable alternative, and there's also a lot of issues with doing that in terms of the CDF was built for fed channel navigation, and it just wasn't considered administratively feasible to get it over the dikes and into the CDF. This is a very safe and common remedy for ensuring that the contaminated material does not migrate.
I'm sorry, when
There
you
was
say
also, I was going to say that there was also some limitations on what material was allowed to go into the CDF, where just city of East Chicago sediment going into the CDF versus from out of the city sediment.
I'm sorry, when you say the ECWMD, you mean the East Chicago Waterway Management District, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
I would invite all of you to take a look at the Indiana statute that created that entity. It has no authority outside of the city of East Chicago. So if you were communicating to the public through an entity that had no authority to be operating in the city of Hammond, if you will, I think you failed there. And I also would point out, when you say that any other remedy was not economical, I think the people of Northwest Indiana deserve better. I think you're dealing again with one of the wealthiest corporations in the world. And I don't think economics should have played any part of that. I think BP can afford to clean up their mess, and they should have been demanded that you should have demanded that they do that.
Are there any other questions or comments for our speakers this morning?
Yes, I do have one more. And I hate to dismiss the previous conversations, but I'll jump. Being a member of the public, what's the plan for the west section?
So I can hop in there. So BP has the lead on that effort. They did some sampling last fall. So they're working with USCPA in validating their data. They're planning for a feasibility study that would be completed. I think they're going to initiate it in December timeframe, or it'll be prepared in the December timeframe. Where they would, identify different options for that area. So it has not yet been identified what the plan is for that area. So they're still looking at the data and seeing, what are we looking at as far as what are the levels of the PAHs and PCBs. So they're still in that process.
Okay, thank you. And will that be open to the public for comment?
There would be a public review. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
And I guess my question back to you all is, what do you all think is an appropriate, Dave, and I'm sorry, I don't know the other gentleman's name that was speaking, but like, what do you all think is an appropriate method for like outreach? Is it the paper? Is it a website? Or what are your thoughts?
I would suggest you have a public meeting. If the city of Hammond, and I don't know why the city of Hammond has not participated in this. I don't know whether there was outreach wasn't made to the right people, or whether they're just disinterested. But I wouldn't hold them responsible for communicating to the public. I mean, if they failed to participate in this, that's their problem, but the public is the one who got shorted. I would suggest that you put it in the newspaper, not in a legal section, but make an announcement and you have a public meeting. And an evening meeting as well, not a daytime one, so people who work can actually participate. And then I would also suggest that this committee look at putting somebody from Hammond on that care committee. Again, I looked at your list of members. There's nobody from Hammond on there. There should be someone from this city or this community on there.
And that was, is that
So
Dave speaking?
I can speak to that last point. So typically, care committee membership is offered to essentially we approach um, the mayors or other executives of each community and with an invitation to participate. And it is then up to the various executives to appoint a member to the care committee. It's not something that we have the ability to force an individual community to undertake. You certainly do have a point, and I will certainly look into trying to improve our representation from all of our AOC communities going forward.
This is Jen Birchfield with NERPC, and I'd just like to say I appreciate the comments that are, you know, and the questions and dialogue that's going on, especially going forward. I'm curious. I'm not familiar. I'm not acquainted. I don't think I've met the individuals who are kind of speaking as a resident from Hammond. So if you're comfortable sharing that, I would just be curious who that is, and you know, going forward as projects are developed, I'd just be curious of your contact info, just kind of to make sure that you're looped in, and maybe things can be kind of run by you. You seem to know the area and have some great ideas for public participation, and you know, certainly the people who live in the area you know, might have the best insight into how to appropriately reach residents.
I am not opposed. My name is Dave Matura. I identified myself as the citizen from Hammond.
Thank you, Dave. I missed that, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
What did you miss?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I missed when you identified yourself earlier, so I apologize for that, but thank you for repeating it for me.
No, I just said I was a citizen. I didn't give my name. I thought when I spoke, my name would highlight in the list of people to the right. So, yeah, Dave Matura is my name.
Yes,
Great.
if I could also add, this is Bob Luger. I'm the assistant commissioner. Also would suggest, kind of following on the comment that was made about possible public meeting, if that is, you know, something you're going to consider and follow through with. Would probably be a very good idea to do basic environmental justice analysis of the area, so that we can make sure if there are folks who are linguistically isolated, possibly non-English speaking, or have lower education levels that may need some assistance more in plain English as to what's going on, that those things are also considered if a public meeting is going to be proposed.
Sure, I will take that back to BP. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments for the speakers? Okay. Hearing none, I'd just like to say that that I personally really appreciate the efforts that everyone went to voice your comments, questions, and concerns. I think it's really helpful to everyone who's involved with these projects, and I know it's not always easy to do so. So I just wanted to thank everybody for that. Um, since um, our co-chair, Mr. Faculty, unfortunately had another appointment, I'm going to take us through the last few portions of our meeting today. Since we're through with that presentation, I'm going to now stop our recording